Today, you're going to practice your English listening skills, as well as learn lots of advanced vocabulary, because you're going on a journey through time, exploring modern Britain from 1960 to the present day. Why 1960? Well, that's when I was born. When I arrived in this world, the UK was a very different place from how it is today, with electronic devices in our pockets. In fact, we were the first people in our street to even have a television. The neighbours would all crowd into our small living room to stare at the tiny screen that took 5 minutes to warm up before it showed a fuzzy black and white picture. In those days, people in the UK had exactly 2 channels to choose from, and they both stopped broadcasting at midnight when the national anthem would come on. Mobile phones didn't exist. Many people, like us, didn't even have a telephone in the house. The internet was still years away, and the closest thing we had to social media was gossiping in the corner shop or reading the local paper. And yet, in many ways, the seeds of the Britain we know today were already being planted. So come with me as we explore 6 decades of British life. The ever-different music that was the soundtrack for generations, the changes that shaped our daily lives, the moments that made us laugh, cry, and occasionally wonder what on earth we were thinking. As usual, there's a free full guide to this lesson, which you can get by clicking the link in the description. But check your email first, because I might have already sent it to you. Hi, I'm Steve. Let's do this. I was born into a world where national service was just ending for young men. Basically, when you turned 18, you had to spend 2 years in the Army, Navy, or Air Force, whether you liked it or not. The Second World War had ended just 15 years earlier, and I remember as a youngster playing in the rubble of houses that had been bombed and not yet rebuilt. Britain was still finding its feet after the war, and we weren't quite the world power we used to be. But something remarkable was about to happen. The 1960s would see Britain lead the world in music, fashion, and the arts. We might not have ruled an empire anymore, but we were about to have something just as powerful: cultural influence. It's not an exaggeration to say that it started with 4 lads who formed a pop band not far from my house in Liverpool. In 1962, the Beatles, you might have heard of them, released their first single, Love Me Do. By 1963, they had conquered Britain. By 1964, they had conquered America. By 1965, they were the most famous people on the planet. Beatlemania wasn't just a music phenomenon, it was a cultural earthquake that shifted the centre of the pop universe from America to Britain. Now, the Beatles might have led the way, but they were quickly followed by the Rolling Stones, The Who, The Kinks, and countless other British bands, creating a sound that the world couldn't get enough of. Fashion followed music. Mary Quant invented the shockingly revealing miniskirt. Twiggy became the world's most famous model. Carnaby Street in London became a pilgrimage site for anyone who wanted to look fashionable. London was swinging, and everyone wanted to be a part of it. But the 60s weren't just about music and fashion. They were about social change too. The contraceptive pill arrived in 1961, giving women control over whether they had babies for the first time in history. The death penalty for criminals was abolished in 1965, divorce laws were made easier, and in general, censorship was relaxed. The decade wasn't without its problems, mind you. The economy had its struggles. By the late 60s, strikes and industrial disputes were becoming more and more common. But for a youngster like me, none of that mattered when All You Need Is Love was playing on the radio. The 1960s ended with humanity's greatest achievement, landing on the moon in 1969. And while it was Americans who took those first steps, much of the technology that got them there had been developed in Britain. We might not have been the first to the moon, but we helped make it possible. If the 60s was about optimism and change, the 70s were all about coming back down to earth with a rather heavy bump. The party was over, and it was time to pay the bill. We can't talk about the 70s without mentioning the fashion. Good grief, what were we thinking? Enormous platform shoes, some even had a live goldfish in them. Seriously, a live fish in your shoes. Flared trousers so wide they were like sails on a yacht, and shirts with collars big enough to take flight in a strong wind. I had a pair of platform boots that added 4 inches to my height. Walking in them was like learning to use stilts, but somehow we all managed it. Music was also going through change. The pop star David Bowie was the first man I'd ever seen wearing makeup. Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd and Queen creating some of the most ambitious rock music ever recorded. And then there was disco. Love it or hate it, everyone was doing the hustle by the end of the decade. Television was changing too. We got our first colour telly, and suddenly everything looked different. But the 70s weren't all glam rock and Saturday Night Fever. The decade had some serious problems. The economy was struggling badly. Prices kept going up. Inflation was so bad that what cost £1 at the beginning of the decade cost nearly 4 by the end. The trouble really started when oil-producing countries decided to quadruple the price of oil almost overnight. Suddenly, everything became more expensive. Not just petrol, but anything that needed to be transported or manufactured. Britain was hit particularly hard because we imported most of our energy. One major change that happened in the 70s that would change Britain's future for decades was in 1973, we joined what was then called the European Economic Community. Basically a trading club of European countries that would eventually become the European Union. At the time, it seemed like a practical decision to help our struggling economy. Most people weren't particularly excited about it, but they weren't particularly worried either. How could we know it would still be causing arguments 50 years later? In early 1974, there came what was known as the 3-day week. To save electricity during a coal miners' strike, businesses were limited to 3 consecutive days of power per week. Picture this. Street lamps were turned off. Television stopped broadcasting early, and families gathered around candles for dinner. It sounds rather cozy now, but at the time, it felt like the country was falling apart. Power cuts became a regular part of life. Everyone had torches ready, and you'd be halfway through watching your favourite TV show when suddenly, click, everything went dark. We all became experts at card games by candlelight and having conversations without the television on in the background. But it wasn't all doom and gloom in the 70s. British comedy flourished. Monty Python's Flying Circus redefined what television comedy could be, while Fawlty Towers gave us John Cleese wonderfully deranged Basil Fawlty. These shows were exported around the world, proving that even when everything else was going wrong, we could still make people laugh. But the decade ended with everyone feeling rather fed up. Lots of industries seemed to shut down and their workers went on strike with monotonous regularity. Rubbish piled high in the streets because the bins weren't collected, the trains didn't run on time, and perhaps most shockingly, gravediggers went on strike. People couldn't bury their loved ones. The papers called it the winter of discontent. But change was coming, whether we were ready for it or not. The 80s arrived in Britain like a neon explosion. Everything became bigger, louder, and more outrageous. This was the decade of giant shoulder pads, hair that defied the laws of physics. And while mobile phones had arrived, they were the size of house bricks and made you look either like a secret agent or a complete plonker, depending on who was watching. This was the era of loads of money. Suddenly, making money wasn't just acceptable, it was something to shout about. Young professionals known as yuppies, wearing red braces, strutted around the cities, swigging champagne and bellowing into those enormous mobiles. But let's mention the elephant in the room, Margaret Thatcher. She became Prime Minister in 1979 and immediately set about changing everything. She privatised huge chunks of British industry. We ordinary Brits were encouraged to buy shares in British Telecom, British Gas, and lots more. Some people made money. I used the money I made to buy my first house. But others wondered why they were now paying bills to companies that used to belong to us all. The early 80s were tough for many people. Unemployment soared, and in 1981 there were serious riots in cities across the UK, even in my Liverpool. But Thatcher was determined to reshape Britain, whatever the cost. As with every decade, music had moved on too. The 80s soundtrack was dominated by manufactured bands that seemed to have come off a factory production line. Duran Duran had us all hungry like a wolf, and the wonderfully peculiar Boy George was a regular topic of conversation. Acoustic was out and electronic was in. Technology was exploding into our homes. Computers for ordinary people had arrived. The ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, BBC Micro. Suddenly, kids were playing games that consisted of about 12 pixels pretending to be a spaceship. Loading a game took 20 minutes and sounded like a robot having a nervous breakdown. But we thought we were living in the future. I can't tell you how excited I was when video recorders became something people like me could afford. These were the days before streaming, so the ability to record a live TV show while you were out and then watch it when you wanted blew everyone away. Video rental shops appeared in every high street, allowing you to rent a Hollywood movie for the night. Surely this was the end of going to the cinema. Fashion was, well, it was certainly something. Leg warmers were being worn by women who'd never seen an aerobics class. Men grew mullets. Their hair was business at the front and a party at the back. They genuinely thought this looked sophisticated. Women's hair was so big it needed to be held up with enough hairspray to punch a hole in the ozone layer. Now everyone likes a good do, and the royal wedding of Charles and Diana in 1981 was pure fairy tale magic. Millions gathered round tellies to watch Diana glide down that endless aisle in St. Paul's Cathedral, her dress so massive it barely fit in the carriage. For a few hours, Britain felt like a place where dreams really could come true. In 1982, the Falklands War happened, and it was a strange affair. Fighting for islands so remote, most of us in the UK had never heard of them. But when our forces retook them from Argentina, there was a genuine national pride that had been missing for years. Britain got a new TV channel in 1982, bringing our total up to a huge 4. The creators, however, obviously weren't very good at names and rather unimaginatively called it Channel 4. The programmes, though, were edgier than anything we'd seen before from the likes of the BBC. It quickly became my and lots of other young adults' favourite thing to watch. In 1985, 2 minor pop stars called Bob Geldof and Midge Ure organised the world's biggest ever concert, which they called Live Aid, with all the proceeds going to African famine relief. It felt like music could actually save the world. When the band Queen stepped out onto the stage at Wembley, the performance was so electrifying, people still talk about it today. Yet underneath all the glitter and shoulder pads, Britain was changing dramatically. Old industries like coal mining disappeared, whole communities shifted, and a new economy emerged. Some people thrived, others got left behind. Margaret Thatcher's downfall, when it came, was swift and brutal. The issue that finished her was called the community charge, but everyone knew it by its nickname, the poll tax. This was Thatcher's attempt to replace local housing tax with a flat tax that everyone would pay, regardless of their income or the value of their property. It was spectacularly unpopular. A millionaire in a mansion would pay the same amount as a pensioner in a tiny flat. So in 1990, people took to the streets to protest. Thatcher was out. Her unlikely successor, John Major, was about as different from Thatcher as it was possible to be. Where she was aggressive and forceful, he was conciliatory. Where she divided opinion, he sought to bring people together. But his time in charge was plagued by problems. In 1992, with a weak economy, a group of rich currency speculators led by a man called George Soros essentially broke the Bank of England. It became known as Black Wednesday. In just one day, the UK lost billions. And that affected ordinary people like me, who saw the money they had to pay for their house loans go through the roof. John Major and the rest of the Conservative Party were also out, which meant Tony Blair and the Labour Party were in. It was the biggest electoral swing in over 50 years. Blair was everything that Labour politicians weren't supposed to be. Young, good on TV, middle class and privately educated. But he understood that to win elections, Labour had to appeal to everyone in England, not just the working class. Blair rebranded the party as New Labour. It felt like the start of something new, and in many ways it was. Tony Blair's first term as Prime Minister coincided with one of those rare moments when Britain felt genuinely optimistic about itself. The economy was growing, unemployment was falling, and British culture was having another global moment. Cool Britannia wasn't just a headline in a newspaper. It captured a real sense that Britain was modern, confident, and relevant again. Bands like Oasis, Blur and Pulp collectively known as Britpop, were filling stadiums and dominating the music charts. British artists like Damien Hirst and Tracey Emin were shocking and delighting the art world in equal measure. British actors were winning Oscars, British directors were making Hollywood blockbusters, and British writers like Nick Hornby and Irvine Welsh were leading the way in contemporary literature. Even our football was improving. Euro 96 had shown that England could host a major tournament and play attractive football. When we lost on penalties to Germany in the semi-final, the disappointment felt different somehow. We were disappointed, but because we expected to win, not because we expected to lose. When Princess Diana died in August 1997, Blair captured the nation's mood perfectly by calling her the People's Princess. Diana's death was one of those moments that defined the decade. The public outpouring of grief was unprecedented. Mountains of flowers outside Kensington Palace, queues stretching for miles to sign books of condolence, and a funeral watched by an estimated 2.5 billion people around the world. It felt like Britain was collectively processing the end of the old and embracing something more emotional and expressive. Across the UK, a minimum wage was introduced. It gave protection to the lowest paid workers for the first time. We heard the phrase devolution being used as new parliaments were created in Scotland and Wales, completely changing the constitution of the United Kingdom. The Human Rights Act that other European countries had had for years was incorporated into British law. Perhaps Blair's biggest achievement happened in 1998. It was called the Good Friday Agreement and brought peace to Northern Ireland after 30 years of conflict. Killings had happened both in Ireland and England. Economically, things couldn't have been better. Gordon Brown, the Chancellor, that's the man in charge of the UK's money, created a framework for economic stability that seemed to work brilliantly. Unemployment fell to levels not seen since the 1970s. House prices rose steadily, but not dramatically. Inflation remained low and stable. For a while, it looked like the Conservative Party might never be in charge again. Before we knew it, the new century arrived. We all held our breath for the Millennium bug, a computer glitch that was supposed to send planes falling from the sky, but in the end, nothing happened. And the biggest anticlimax was the Millennium Dome in London, a huge white tent full of disappointing exhibits. It all felt very British somehow, a grand idea that didn't quite work. On the 11th of September 2001, the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York changed everything, not just for America, but for Britain too. The UK immediately aligned with the US response, and from that moment, Blair, the golden boy of politics, started to look shaky. He agreed in 2003 that together with the US, Britain would invade Iraq. It was very controversial. Our government insisted that their leader, Saddam Hussein, possessed weapons of mass destruction that posed a threat to British interests. When no such weapons were found, many felt they'd been lied to. This led to the largest peacetime demonstration in British history, with over 1 million people marching against the war. Immigration also increased dramatically during this period. The expansion of the European Union to include Eastern European countries in 2004 gave millions of new EU citizens the right to work in Britain. Far more came than the government predicted. They estimated 13,000 per year, but 170,000 arrived in the first year alone. By the mid-2000s, the writing was on the wall, and by 2007, Blair was gone. He had modernised Britain, brought peace to Northern Ireland, and presided over a decade of economic growth, but Iraq would forever taint his legacy. In July 2005 came a dark day. London was celebrating winning the bid for the 2012 Olympics, but the very next morning, suicide bombers attacked the transport network. The shock echoed through the nation. On a lighter note, this was the beginning of reality TV. Instead of the usual stars and performers, people like you and me were appearing on shows like Big Brother. We were all hooked. We had ditched our dial-up internet for broadband, and suddenly the online world was always on. Mobile phones were no longer just for calls, they had cameras and could play music. Economically, the early to mid-2000s felt pretty prosperous. We saw house prices continue to rise, and people were happy to spend. The shops were always full. But that all came crashing down in 2008 with the global financial crisis. It hit Britain hard, leading to recession and a lot of uncertainty about the future. The government, which was by now a mixture of two political parties, decided that Britain had to tighten its belt, and everyone started to feel the squeeze as public services such as the national health, education and others faced huge cutbacks to their budgets. But the decade also had its moments of national pride. The wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton in 2011 was a huge spectacle, and the next year London hosted a truly brilliant Olympic Games, and for a few weeks the country was bathed in sunshine and a wave of positivity. Britain also celebrated the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, marking 60 years on the throne. The 2010s was the decade of the smartphone. Everyone, from teenagers to pensioners, seemed to have a powerful computer in their pocket. Social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter became central to daily life, and we all learned to pay for things by tapping a card or a phone. This was also when streaming services like Netflix and Spotify became the normal way to watch films and listen to music. Although in the UK, even if you never watched it, you still had to pay for a TV license or face jail. But without a doubt, the defining political moment of the decade was the 2016 referendum on leaving the European Union. The Leave campaign won by a narrow margin, a result that surprised almost everyone and exposed deep divisions in the country. The word Brexit entered our vocabulary and dominated the news for years. In fact, it still does. It led to political turmoil and the resignation of two prime ministers. Boris Johnson became Prime Minister in July 2019 with a promise to get Brexit done. This finally happened on the 31st of January 2020, but even then it wasn't really done. The transition period lasted until the end of 2020, and the full implications of leaving are still being worked out today. But just as the country was starting to navigate its new relationship with the world, an even bigger story unfolded. The COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe, and Britain, like most other countries, went into lockdown. Life changed overnight. The streets fell silent. Lots of people like me began working from home. The National Health Service, or NHS, was under immense pressure, and every Thursday evening, people of Britain stood on their doorsteps to clap for the medical staff. It was a strange and difficult time for everyone. The pandemic accelerated many changes, particularly in technology. Remote working became mainstream, and businesses that had been slow to adapt to the digital world, well, they had to catch up quickly. Johnson's premiership was increasingly scandal-ridden. Partygate, revelations about lockdown breaking parties in Downing Street while the rest of us were stuck at home, damaged his reputation for good. But it was his appointment of a person he knew had been accused of sexual misconduct to an important job in the government that finally finished him off. Johnson was gone. He was briefly succeeded by Liz Truss, whose premiership was the shortest in British history. As the newspapers said at the time, a lettuce lasts longer. In September 2022, the nation experienced a moment of huge change with the death of Queen Elizabeth II after a reign of 70 years. It was the end of an era, and we watched as her son became King Charles III. As we move through the middle of the decade, Britain is still a country grappling with big questions. We're dealing with the long-term effects of the pandemic, the economic realities of life outside the EU, and the urgent need to address climate change. Our society is more diverse than ever, but also feels more divided than it has in a long time. It's a complex and often uncertain picture, but the story as always continues. Currently, at the time I'm making this video, we're being led by Keir Starmer and a Labour government, but for how long? Well, your guess is as good as mine. So there we are, Britain from 1960 to 2025, from my birth to the present day. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've gone from a country where homosexuality was illegal and women couldn't get a mortgage, that's a loan from a house, without their husband's permission, to one of the most socially liberal societies in the world. We've gone from having just 2 television channels to having infinite entertainment at our fingertips. We've gone from being a faded imperial power to being a modern, multicultural democracy. Some things have improved beyond recognition. Britain today is more tolerant, more diverse, and more prosperous than the Britain of 1960. And we have opportunities our grandparents could never have imagined. Other things we've lost along the way. The sense of shared community that held us together in the post-war decades, well, that's fragmented. The institutions that once commanded automatic respect, Parliament, the police, the press, the church, have all seen their authority diminish. The economy, security that previous generations took for granted, has given way to more flexible, but more precarious world of work. Perhaps most significantly, we've lost our sense of what Britain is for the world. The empire is long gone. Our relationship with Europe remains complicated, and our role as America's closest ally doesn't carry the influence it once did. But here's what hasn't changed. We're still the people who gave the world parliamentary democracy, who stood strong with our allies against fascism in 1940, who created the NHS and the BBC. We're still the people who can laugh at ourselves, queue patiently, and make a decent cup of tea in a crisis. In the end, we're unmistakably British, and after 64 years of watching this country change and adapt and muddle through, I wouldn't want to be anything else. Thanks for joining me on this journey through modern Britain. Now, shall we put the kettle on?